Hello, my name's William Ingram and I'm one of the founders of Threads of Life. And what I'd like to share with you here is a presentation I made for Fashion Revolution Week through Bali Slow Fashion. There's three parts to it. First is a walk around in the garden and the dye studio. The second part is a short visit to some indigo farmers that we work with in East Bali. And the third part is a presentation, an illustrated presentation. So enjoy. Okay, let's walk through the dye garden first. So here we've got specimens of about 80 different dye plants that we've collected from the communities that we work with. And they've all been scientifically identified, that's a very common one. And divided by color into different sections. This is like the best yellow dye plant, but it's the most difficult to cultivate. It takes about 100 years to get a tree worth harvesting. Now we're adding some additional space here, and come into the space. Here are our friends from Kuban who've been working on figuring out how to do better indigo work on their batik. And our indigo vats are all around the edge of the room here. That's the one we're using today. It's ready to use. Over the other side is where we're doing the cherry-ops dyeing, the mangrove bark. We keep it separate, obviously, so that we don't get splashing of one color on the other. At the back there is where we do our yellow work with Nanka. And here we are experimenting or teaching how to use the cherry-ops dye with the batik. So there's a quick virtual tour. So over here, this is some yarn we have been mordanting with the candlenut oil that I talked about. This is all going to be dyed red. So this gives you an idea of the kind of scale we can work on when we're doing dyeing on yarn. So, hope you get to come here someday yourself soon. Bye. I'd like to say some more now about what we do in our dye studio, why we do it, and the colours that we produce. If we're asking about natural dyes, the question arises, why are natural dyes what is sought, and what is the sustainability aspects of natural dye use? One really important aspect of why people choose natural dyes is the aesthetic dimension. When we look at natural dyes, there are many colours actually at work in what we're seeing. A plant doesn't produce a simple single colour like a chemical process does, like we see in a synthetic dye. Indigo, for instance, is not just the colour blue that we get. There are also reds and yellows that come in very small quantities from the plants and enrich the colour that we see. So it's this depth of colour that becomes part of the visual interest of the dye. We also get variation in the colour over time. You're using plants at different seasons, the same plant at different seasons. You're using the same plant from different places. There are variations between even the same plant within the same place. And you'll get these seasonal variations as well. So the colour is something that's living and changing and will never be exactly the same. And this lack of uniformity is part of the beauty of what we can achieve. Think of an oriental carpet where the brush of colour, that change of colour, is one of the aesthetic jewels of what we're looking at. In terms of fashion revolution week, though, perhaps we want to look more deeply at the ethical dimension of why natural dyes are being used. Clearly, this is respect to environmental sustainability that we first think about natural dyes. It's also about the fact that we're buying these from farmers. So there's about the fairness in the value chains and the fairness of the trade that goes into how much those farmers are being paid. When we think specifically about the natural dyes, we've got to think quite broadly about it. We've got to think about where the plants came from. Were they harvested responsibly? Was it done in a way that was destructive to the environment, especially if they're taken from natural systems and forests? Natural dyes can be processed in a way that uses other plants to prepare the dye vats, or you can use chemicals, you can use synthetic processes to prepare a natural dye. And so those can be both safe and harmful. That needs to be investigated. Synthetic dyes can also be performed in safe and harmful ways. So then we have the ethical choice of whether to use a safe synthetic dye or a harmful natural dye process. It's complex in what we're doing here. Where we're looking to go with our dye work is the top left-hand corner of this Venn diagram that I've placed here. The responsible harvesting, safe natural dye processes, natural dyes by natural processes. This brings us also to the fact that a lot of what has to be done in promoting natural dyes is education. People don't understand this complexity. People don't know what they're looking at, even when they go into a natural dye factory, to see how would they evaluate these processes, how would they ask about where the dye is coming from, how would they know whether the water being discharged from the place is safe to go back into the environment or not. But these are the questions that, as people working in the industry, we have to start asking ourselves. The values that guide Threads of Life's work and our dye work really come from the communities that we've been working with over the last 2 decades. The natural dyes by natural processes is what we have learned from the communities that we're engaged with. This is what we studied when we were working with them, and this is what we're now looking to scale up in our production capacity. So this really comes down to it being applied research. There are several aspects to the applied research we've done over time. Initially, we were working with communities to help document their dye processes in order to help improve them. There had been 2 decades of moving towards the use of synthetic dyes. And this leaving behind of natural dye process had meant that some parts of that, those recipes, had been forgotten or not thought important again. The picture here is from Malacca in Timor. And what we have here, this red dye on these skirts that these women are wearing, they are dyed with the bark of the root of the Morinda citrifolia tree. It's a very easily grown tree. You've got to wait about a decade before you can start harvesting the roots. But then you can do that sustainably. But in order to get it to fix to cotton, you have to use a fixative. You have to use what's called a mordant. We'll get to the mordant later. But the use of this mordant is critical. If you don't use enough of it, then no matter how much dye you have in the dye vat, it won't adhere to the cotton. So in working with this community's dye recipe, in increasing the amount of mordant, the Simplocos plant, that they were using, in connecting them with harvester groups that could supply them where the traditional market chains had broken down, they were able to get the same color with half as much dye, half as much time, better for the environment, better for their profitability. This is the kind of research we want to do in bringing it back to the field. It's also about the cultivation of the plants. Here's an example. So you remember from the video in the garden, I said, here's this really wonderful yellow plant. So Maclura cochinensis, it's one of the main components of the brown yellow dye that's used in traditional batiks in central Java. And it has been harvested to commercial extinction over much of its range, particularly in eastern Indonesia. Doesn't mean it's extinct. There are still plenty of trees about, but they are not of a size that you can use in dye processes. One community where they continue to have plants, where they've safeguarded their landscape, the problem is that cattle have been allowed to roam free. This is a problem all across Timor. The tradition was to use water buffalo, and these were swapped for cattle in the 60s and 70s, where water buffalo would stay near a water source. Cattle allowed to roam free go everywhere, eat everything. And you can see here the results of that. You get this sort of badland result where topsoil is eroded and everything small is either eaten or trodden on. So for our Maclura plants in this landscape, you have the big vines that were there before the cattle were set free, and you have tiny little plants that are just sprouting and have not either been stood on or eaten, and nothing in between. So working with ethnobotanists, Tony Cunningham's been a great support for us over time. His understanding of plants brought us the idea that the Maclura cochinensis, which has these incredibly big thorns, can be used as a fencing material. So growing it in the fencing to keep the cattle in place gives it a short-term value where its long-term value can be the natural dye. To grow a plant to the size that is in the top left-hand corner here, that could be 80 or 100 years. So a farmer today is going to look at that both in terms of its short-term value, that's why he'll plant it, and its long-term value to his great-grandchildren, that's why he'll keep it. What we come back to when we bring all of this knowledge back into the dye studio is that we're using these traditional recipes that have been time-tested for their colour fastness, their consistency, their quality, and their beauty. And so it's taking those recipes and that understanding and learning how to scale it up from the 20-litre earthenware dye pot into something that we can do on a commercial scale. So this leaves us with a palette of colours of browns and blues and yellows. We can also add a grey and a black done from mud dyeing from different communities. And what we're looking at is how to be transparent and accountable at all stages of our value chain. And this is what the market is more and more interested in. This is what major brands, high street brands, have committed themselves to, because it's what they see that their customers will be looking for more and more. I was talking to a buyer from one brand in America, and they said, we're having to do this at whatever cost. This is non-negotiable. And so we have an opportunity now to participate in this growth, to participate in this change, and establish ways that smallholder farmers can participate in this process through smallholder dye studios like ours. So I want to look at the dyes one by one. Indigo. The indigo plant that we're mostly using is the one pictured here, Strobilanthus cusia. It's the one that was in the little video that I showed you earlier as well. And you see it growing in forest agroforestry systems as an understory plant. It's not indigenous to Indonesia. It's also known as Assam indigo, and it grows well in the Himalayas. That's where it's from. But as a hybrid, it doesn't go to seed. So we don't have it becoming invasive. And it allows us to plant something in as an understory in forest garden systems, whereas the indigofera that we could use in other places would give the farmers a choice between planting food or planting dye. Here the Strobilanthus is much more additional rather than replacing, and doesn't affect food security. So currently we've got farmers in different places have expanded this to between like 60 or 70 hectares of indigo growing across the islands. So we have a good supply chain of this going. The reduction of the indigo fat, by reduction here I mean chemical reduction, that turns it from blue to yellow, which means it's in a position where you can start to dye it. We use palm sugar for that. We use palm sugar and tamarind, but I'm going to talk about the palm sugar here. So what we're working with is palm sugar tappers in order to produce the sugar that we use in the dye vats. You'll notice from this picture here, the sharp among you, this is not actually a coconut palm, this is not actually Bali. These are pictures from Savu and from Timor, showing the lontar palm, but the process is the same. Another component of that traditional dye from the batik in central Java, the brown component of it, is Chiriops tagal. which is a mangrove species. Now, we know that mangroves are overexploited. It's not a good idea to be harvesting mangroves in an unsustainable way. Mangrove forests are the nursery for many pelagic fish, and they provide erosion control, tsunami prevention, mitigation. So here we've got this beautiful dye. We want to use it. Where do we get it from? We found a Forest Stewardship Council certified concession for a mangrove forest in Papua. And the bark is a side product of their wood chip producing that they use for paper making. So the Forest Stewardship Council, if you've seen in a book, you open the front of the book and there's a little tree shape with a check mark on it, and it's underneath it, it says sustainable sources or renewable sources or 100% renewable sources. That is the Forest Stewardship Council mark. And so this is where we're getting this dye from. So we want to have these kind of values backing up and this kind of documentation and accountability backing up the colours that we use. We've talked about this mordant. So the Symplochus cotrichinensis, we found that the best part of the plant to use is the fallen leaves. We did this in research with Kew Gardens in London. We sent fallen leaves, fresh leaves, bark and wood to have it analysed for its aluminium content, because it's the aluminium that is being used. And this is a plant that's called an aluminium hyperaccumulator. It grows best in soils that have a high aluminium content, and the aluminium, which is not good for biological processes, is stored in different parts of the plant in order to mitigate its impact. And the fallen leaves are wonderfully the best place for that to be found by us. So it's just, we've set up groups of women in the forests where it is growing, and they just walk through the forest during its deciduous period between July and September, and just pick them up off the floor. They're bright yellow, they're easy to determine. And so we've set up a payment process. We go there each year, buy these leaves, and we've worked out the labour and the cost, so this is at least as good as the coffee that they grow. So they're making more money than they do making your cup of coffee in the morning. The yellow that we use, because that Maclura cotrichinensis is not a sustainable source, we use jackfruit wood. The wood is used extensively in Bali to make temple shrines. So there are always offcuts. And one of our staff lives near a place where those offcuts can be obtained. And she brings them into the studio for us to work with. It's a tree that's also grown for its fruit. So it's in forest gardens and it's being cultivated. We found a real issue was finding a source of soap for the scouring, the cleaning of the yarn and the cloth before we dye it, and the finishing, the washing of the cloth after we've dyed it. What we needed was a pH-neutral soap that had no fragrance and no colour in it. And even with all the soap manufacturers, the artisanal producers here in Bali, we couldn't find one. So we started working with a cold-pressed oil made by one of the weaving communities we work with, this one here in Timor. So with help from an oil producer in Australia, and again, that ethnobotanist Tony I talked about earlier, we trained this community to make this cold-pressed candlenut oil. Candlenut oil is candlenuts are readily available on the local market, and from that we produce a simple, clean, easily to use soap that is used in the studio. We then therefore get to the wastewater that is produced from the studio. Initially I thought there were going to be all kinds of problems with the dyes and the lime from the indigo process and the pH, but it turns out there's enough water used in the washing and scouring processes that is really diluted and mitigated. The soap becomes the only significant issue, and by having a settling tank, we can allow the water to settle and then use it to irrigate our dye garden, which you see here does very well with it. So our capacities, we can produce about 400 meters of cloth per month. So this is not a huge volume of production. This is small, artisanal. We're looking for designers to work with who are working at this scale and who understand the values and share the values that we're looking to embody in what we're doing. So our prices are high, but the whole issue we're talking about here is that the true price of sustainable fashion is much higher than currently being paid on the high street. So this is what it really costs to do natural, non-polluting processes, plant-based processes, and properly paid producers throughout the value chain. Thank you for your attention, and if you want to know more about what we're doing, please visit our website or send me an email. Always happy to correspond.